September 22nd, 1906, marked an episode of mass racial violence against black people living in Atlanta. The Atlanta Race Riot, also known as the Atlanta Race Massacre, describes violent attacks by armed mobs of white Americans, resulting in the death and displacement of a disputable number of African Americans. African Americans in the U.S. have been a target for several racial injustices for generations. The denial of human rights during slavery, ruthless massacres and killings, the establishment of partial societies, and the use of black women for experimental purposes that broke grounds for modern medicine speaks volumes about the kind of societal foundation America on. As a result, labeling of Black History course as unimportant is a grand scheme perpetuated by the insecurity that the truth may be exposed to those who don't already know it, or simply cannot handle it. The cause of the Atlanta attacks was said to have been triggered after local newspapers published several unsubstantiated reports accusing a group of black men of the rape of 4 white women. However, there was a more deep-rooted underlying cause that has long fueled the strive towards black Americans living in Atlanta. After the end of the American Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, there was countless undocumented violence against blacks, as whites were heavily threatened by the emancipation and growing population of the black community. African Americans had established prosperous businesses and had produced an elite working class competing for housing, jobs, and social amenities. Although the police and fire departments were still exclusively white, as well as most employees in the city and county governments, having former slaves gradually became equal members of society and exercising political rights increased racial tensions. The violence lasted through September 24th, 1906. These events were reported by newspapers around the world and recorded as one of the most gruesome racial violence ever experienced. Black Americans were hanged from lampposts. Others were shot, beaten, or stabbed to death. They were pulled out of streetcars and attacked on the street. A lot of black neighborhoods were also attacked. Properties were destroyed. Saloons and other booming black businesses were also vandalized. Many lost their lives, and those who survived had one disturbing story or another to tell. The aftermath of the massacre was characterized by a death toll of 25 to 30 black men and women, with 90 injured, reported by the New York Times. These figures aroused an uprising, as residents and witnesses claimed that the massacre claimed the lives of close to 100 black people. Survivors of the massacre were said to have fled by train and other means, seeking safety at a distance. There were rumors that the Atlanta Police Department and some guardsmen took part in the attacks. Local histories by whites ignored the massacre for decades. It was not until 2006 that the event was publicly marked on its 100th anniversary. The true impacts of slavery during the transatlantic slavery era is another aspect of Black history that is poorly talked about. Slavery was introduced to the American colonies in the early 17th century and became an integral part of the Southern agriculture economy. Enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to America and subjected to brutal conditions, forced labor, and dehumanization. In the pre-Civil War United States, a stronger case can be made that slavery played a significant role in economic development. One crop, slave-grown cotton, provided over half of all U.S. export earnings. By 1840, the South grew 60% of the world's cotton and provided 70% of the cotton used by the British textile industry, all thanks to the continuous exploitation of captured black people. The northern industries also had their fair share of this, as large-scale slave labor ensured southern plantations supplied raw materials for manufacturing. Industries such as textiles and shipping directly or indirectly benefited from the exploitation of enslaved labor. The Tulsa Riot is yet another aspect of Black history that raises a lot of hair. The Tulsa Riot of 1921 was a 2-day-long massacre that claimed about 300 lives and led to the destruction of approximately 1,200 properties in Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The attacks were orchestrated by white supremacist terrorists, some of whom were white residents, backed by political persons, including city government officials. Before the May attacks, Tulsa's black business district, known simply as Greenwood, flourished in spite of massive segregation. Greenwood was an economic powerhouse that boasted several restaurants, theaters, clothing shops, and hotels managed by black individuals. This could explain why it was commonly referred to as the Black Wall Street. It was said that the strained relationship between the white and black communities was the primary generator of the crisis. However, the events that kickstarted the massacre started after an encounter between Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white elevator operator, and Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black teenager. There are discrepancies among several accounts given about what transpired between the two in the elevator, but the most common being that Dick Rowland accidentally stepped on Page's foot in the elevator, throwing her off balance, and when he reached out to keep her from falling, she screamed, raising alarm in the Drexel building. Although Sarah Page released a statement where she told the police that Rowland had grabbed her arm, nothing more, and would not press charges, many Tulsans were fed by the media that Rowland forcefully attacked Page. This was further escalated by a popular local newspaper headline that encouraged the lynching of Rowland. A white mob gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held, demanding his lynching. In response, a group of armed black men arrived to protect Rowland. A confrontation between the two groups turned violent, resulting in the deaths of several people. Violence broke out as armed white men looted and destroyed millions worth of property belonging to African Americans. The white mob began setting fires mainly in businesses on Commercial Archer Street at the southern edge of the Greenwood district. Firemen were prevented from intervening, and the few that got close enough were held at gunpoint. None of the men were killed, but they were forced to watch dozens of black businesses and properties burn down to nothing. Black people in the neighborhood took up arms in defense, but their numbers and weaponry were greatly overpowered. This forced a massive exodus from the city. Law enforcement officials claimed to have made reconnaissance to prevent a supposed black uprising, but the accounts of several eyewitnesses state otherwise. It was said that airplanes carrying white assailants fired rifles and dropped firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing families. The Tulsa Race Massacre had a profound impact on the African American community in Tulsa. The once thriving Greenwood district was left in ruins, and the economic and social progress made by the black community was significantly set back. Yet another massacre that shook the black community is the Move bombing. The Move bombing refers to a tragic incident that took place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on May 13, 1985. It involved the Philadelphia Police Department's attempt to end a standoff with a radical group called Move. The event resulted in the destruction of an entire city block and the deaths of 11 people, including 5 children. Move was a black liberation group founded in the early 1970s. The group advocated for a range of issues that felt were of societal concern. They lived communally in a house in West Philadelphia, which they fortified with barricades and weapons. Tensions between Move and the local community had been escalating for years. Authorities had also accused the group of using indiscriminate confrontational tactics and engagement in illegal activities. On May 13, 1985, the police attempted to execute arrest warrants for several Move members, as well as gain control of their fortified house. It quickly turned into a violent confrontation with gunfire exchange. Eventually, the police decided to use force to end the standoff. An order was given to drop an explosive device known as a satchel bomb onto the roof of the Move house. The bomb ignited a fire that spread rapidly due to the use of combustible materials inside the house. Despite firefighters being present at the scene, the decision was made to let the fire burn rather than actively extinguish it. As a result, the fire quickly got out of control and engulfed not only the Move house, but also neighboring buildings. In total, 61 homes were destroyed, leaving many people homeless. 11 Move members, including the group's leader, John Africa, and 5 children, died in the blaze. The move bombing was met with widespread condemnation and raised significant questions about the use of force by law enforcement agencies. It led to a contentious investigation and multiple lawsuits. In the aftermath, changes were made within the Philadelphia Police Department, including improved training and protocols for handling similar situations. The move bombing remains a tragic and controversial event in American history, serving as a reminder of the complex challenges surrounding law enforcement tactics, especially against Black people. You might have heard of J. Marion Sims, the father of minor gynecology, but have you heard about how he came about this title? J. Marion Sims, a 19th century American physician, is known for his advancements in gynecology surgery. However, his methods and practices involving enslaved Black women have drawn criticism and controversy. Sims conducted numerous experimental procedures on enslaved women without their consent or the use of anesthesia. Sims performed surgeries to address medical conditions such as vesicovaginal fistulas, a condition causing urinary incontinence. He used enslaved Black women as subjects for his experiments, often subjecting them to multiple surgeries without proper anesthesia or pain relief. The woman endured immense pain and suffering during these procedures. These ethical violations and the exploitation of Black women for medical experimentation are deeply troubling. Sims' actions reflect a dark chapter in the history of medicine, highlighting the systematic racism and devaluation of Black lives that existed during that time. Modern medical ethics have evolved to prioritize informed consent, patient autonomy, and compassion, aiming to prevent the repetition of such exploitative practices. Today, Sims is hailed as the father of modern gynecology. A speculum he used in carrying out many of his experiment procedures is named after him. As far as medicine goes, the cries and misery endured by the Black enslaved women fall into topics that have been swept under the rug. Schools today are more focused on white achievement over the centuries, neglecting the struggles and contributions to the American state. Although Black history is still being taught in schools, however, the organic reality of it has been watered down a little too much, with depictions that are too far from the actual reality. One of the most controversial topics being argued across the political aisle today involves state lawmakers and politicians who have combined efforts to ensure that African American histories stay out of classrooms or at least not taught to the full scope. A more typical opinion by the anti-Black history movement is the branding of African American history as lacking in academic value. A perspective from the right-wing conservatives claims that teaching Black history in classrooms could demoralize and marginalize Blacks and other minorities and motivate them to vote. Although the majority in the legislative space conform to these ideologies, critics of this movement are of the opinion that this ban is simply a grand scheme to silence the truth that America was built on the sweat, blood, and anguish of African Americans.